Hello, all you Texas Monthly Bedtime Story people. I'm Skip Hollandsworth. I'm going to read you a story I wrote based upon what happened in my old Dallas neighborhood. Years ago, I used to drive by this little ramshackle house and wonder who lived there because the windows were never open. And I would drive by there for years. And one day, coincidentally, totally out of the blue, my wife read an obituary that showed a photo of a high school boy, the most handsome teenager I'd ever seen in my life, wearing his high school football uniform. I then, by coincidence, drove by that house again, and there were cars parked in front of it. And for some reason, I stopped the car, walked up to the front door, rang the doorbell, and asked the person that answered it, "Is this the home of the boy that was in the obituary today?" And from that has come this story. It's called Still Life. Compared to the glistening two-story mansions that surrounded it, the house looked like something out of another time. It was only 2,100 square feet. Its red brick exterior was crumbling, and its gutters were clogged with leaves. Paint-chipped blinds sagged behind the windows. Next to the concrete steps leading to the front door, a banana plant clung to life. Built in 1950, it was one of the last of the original single-story homes in Dallas's Preston Hollow neighborhood. The newer residents had no idea who lived there. Over the years, they'd see an ambulance pull up to the front of the house. They'd watch as paramedics carried out someone covered in a blanket. And a few days later, they'd see the paramedics return to carry that person back inside. But they had never learned who it was or what had happened. Some of the local kids were convinced that the house was haunted. They'd ride their bikes by the lot at dusk, daring one another to ring the doorbell or to run across the front lawn. None of these neighbors knew that mailmen once delivered boxes of letters to the front door, and that total strangers left plates of food or envelopes stuffed with money on the porch. They didn't know that high school kids, whenever they drove past this house, blew their horns over and over. They didn't know that a church youth group had stood on that front yard one afternoon, faced the house, and sung a hymn. In fact, it wasn't until the spring of last year that they learned that the little house used to be one of Dallas's most famous residences, known throughout the city as the McClamrock House. It was the home of Anne McClamrock and her son John, the boy who could not move. This story begins on the morning of October 17th, 1973. John McClamrock bounded out of bed, threw on bell-bottom pants, and a loud patterned shirt with an oversized collar. He jumped into his red El Camino with a vinyl roof, and he raced off to Hillcrest High School, only 6 blocks away. He was then 17 years old, and according to one girl who had dated him, he was the all-American boy, just heartbreakingly beautiful. He had china blue eyes and wavy black hair that fell over his forehead. And when he smiled, dimples creased his cheeks. Sometimes when he sacked groceries at the neighborhood Tom Thumb, the high school girls would show up to buy watermelons so that they'd watch him carry them out to their cars. On weekend nights, they'd head for Forest Lane, the cruising spot for Dallas teenagers, hoping to get a look at him in his El Camino. That day when the lunch period bell rang, John drove to the nearest Burger King to grab a Whopper. He pushed buttons on the radio until he found the Allman Brothers' Ramblin' Man. He turned up the volume. He pressed down on the gas pedal to get to school. He walked past the auditorium and then on to the boys' locker room to put on his football uniform. John, or Clam as he was known among his friends, had a game that afternoon. Earlier that summer, John had quit playing for the Hillcrest Panthers so he could work extra hours at Tom Thumb to pay off his El Camino. When he tried to rejoin the team at the start of the junior year, the coaches had ordered him to spend a few weeks on the JV squad. He was 5 feet 11 inches tall. He weighed 160 pounds. He played tackle on offense, linebacker on defense, and he was the wedge buster on the kickoffs, assigned the task of breaking up the other team's front line of blockers. That afternoon, John was determined to show the coaches what he could do. This was the week, he vowed to his buddies, that he would get promoted to varsity. On Hillcrest's opening kickoff, he burst through the other team's blockers and zeroed in on the ball carrier. He lowered his head, and as the two collided, John's chin caught the runner's thigh. The sound, one teammate later said, was like a tree trunk breaking in half. John's head snapped back. He fell face first to the ground. For the next several seconds, according to another teammate, there was nothing but a terrible silence. Because there were no cell phones in that era, a coach ordered one of the players to run to the high school's main office to call an ambulance. When it arrived 15 minutes later, John was still on the ground, his body strangely still. "Oh, you've got some pinched nerves," a referee told him, speaking into the ear hole of his helmet. "You'll be up in no time." But as soon as he was wheeled into Presbyterian Hospital, doctors knew he was in trouble. They gave him a complete neurological exam, scraping a pencil across the bottom of his feet, taking x-rays. They ordered that his head be shaved and 2 small holes be bored into the top of his skull. Large tongs, like the ones used to carry blocks of ice, were attached to the holes, and 70 pounds of weight was hung from the tongs in an attempt to realign his spine. A Hillcrest administrator called John's mother at her office at a local bank. Ann McClamrock was 54 years old, green-eyed with strawberry blonde hair. She always had extra food in the refrigerator for the neighborhood kids who came running in and out of the house. On weekends, she loved to throw boisterous dinner parties. When she arrived at the hospital, a doctor took her aside and quietly asked if she had any religious preference. "Well, I'm Catholic," Ann said, giving him a bewildered look. "Maybe you should call your priest," the doctor said. "We're not sure John is going to make it through the night." The doctor told Ann that John had severely damaged his spinal cord and was paralyzed from the neck down. He was able to swivel his head from side to side, but because his circulatory system had been disrupted, causing his blood pressure to fluctuate wildly, he could not lift his head without blacking out. It couldn't be any worse, the doctor said. Ann stood at her son's bedside until her husband, Mac, who had been out of town that day — he worked for a company that insured 18-wheelers — arrived with the McClamrock's other child, Henry, a quiet boy who was a freshman at the high school. She slowly turned to the doctor, her hands trembling. She said, "My Johnny is not going to die." And then, her voice choking, she fell into her husband's arms. John made it through the night and then through the next day. His friends flocked to the hospital, many of them dropped off at the front door by their parents. One night, nearly 100 kids were in the ICU waiting room. There were so many phone calls coming into the hospital about John that extra operators were brought in to work the switchboard. The local newspapers jumped on the story, and soon just about everyone in Dallas was following John's struggle to stay alive. Dallas Cowboys coach Tom Landry and star defensive back Charlie Waters came by to see him. The owner of the local Bonanza Steakhouse chain held a John McClamrock Day, donating 10% of all the restaurant's sales to a medical fund. Buy a drink for Johnny booths were set up at shopping malls all over the city. And at Hillcrest High School alone, there was a bake sale, a benefit basketball game, a bowl-a-thon, a 50s dance, even a paper drive conducted by the Ecology Club. After one of the newspapers ran a story about John, he received hand-drawn get-well cards from Texas schoolchildren. He got sentimental notes from teenage girls who had never met him. The story went national on the AP wire, and in November, a letter arrived at the hospital from the most unlikely places of all, the White House. President Richard Nixon, who was in the midst of his spectacular downfall from the Watergate scandal, had read about John and stopped what he was doing to write him a sympathetic note. "You have a devoted family and many friends cheering for you," the president wrote, "and we are proud to join them in sending warm wishes to you always." In December, doctors suggested that John be moved to the Texas Institute of Rehabilitation in Houston, which specialized in spinal injuries. "Maybe someone down there that can get him to move," they said. When he left Presbyterian, students stood by the hospital's exit and held up signs that read, "Good luck, Clam. We love you, John. Come back soon." Ann lived in an apartment near the rehabilitation center. Mac and Henry visited on weekends. John stayed in a ward with other paralyzed men, going through 2 hours of physical therapy every day. The following March, 1974, when 40 of his friends showed up to surprise him on his 18th birthday, they gave him the new albums that had just come out by Elton John in Chicago. He was too weak to blow out the candles on the cake. But he assured them that the therapy was working. Speaking into a telephone receiver held by his mother, he told a Dallas Morning News reporter that he would walk again and probably would go back to playing football. "I will never give up," he said in a voice as firm as he could muster. But late that spring, doctors met with Ann, Mac, and Henry in a conference room. Staring at their notes, they said that not a single muscle below John's neck had shown any response. He still couldn't raise his head without losing consciousness, they said, which meant there was almost no chance he would be able to sit in a wheelchair. One of the staffers took a breath. "We found that 95% of the families that try to take care of someone in this condition cannot handle it," she said. "The families break up." The staffer handed the McClamrock family a sheet of paper. "These are the names of institutions and nursing homes that we know will take good care of him," she said. Ann nodded, stood up, and said, "We will be taking Johnny home, thank you." A relative arrived with a station wagon. John was loaded into the back, and the McClamrocks returned to Dallas. Mac, Henry, and a couple of others carried John, who was wearing his Hillcrest High School football jersey, into the house. They twisted him into a sort of L shape as they turned down the hall and turned again into the bedroom, where they laid him on a hospital bed with a laminate headboard. To make everything look as normal as possible, Anne redecorated the bedroom, hanging photos on the wall of John in his uniform. She displayed the football used in the game where he was injured. It had been signed by his teammates. Because she had heard John tell his friends that he was determined to go hunting again, she had Mac buy him a Remington 12-gauge shotgun, which she hung on another wall. Then she told her son, "Here we are. Here is where you are going to get better." Every morning before sunrise, she got out of bed, did her makeup and hair, put on a nice dress or pantsuit, dabbled perfume on her neck, and walked into John's room. She shaved him, clipped his nails, brushed his teeth, gave him a sponge bath, shampooed his hair, and scratched his nose when it itched. She fed him all his meals, serving him one bite of food after another. She taped a straw to the side of his glass that he could drink on his own. She changed his catheter, emptied the drainage bag when it filled up with urine, and she dutifully cleaned his bottom as if he were a newborn whenever he had a bowel movement. To prevent bed sores, she turned him constantly throughout the day, rolling him onto one side and holding him in place with pillows, then rolling him onto his back, then rolling him onto his other side, over and over and over. From Monday through Saturday, she never left the house. On Sunday morning, she went to Mass at Christ the King Catholic Church. She lit a candle for John, and she put a $10 check in the collection box. Afterwards, she drove to Tom Thumb, the same one where John used to work, to buy groceries. Once a month, she'd treat herself to a permanent at the hair salon at J.C. Penney. But that was it. Every other minute was devoted to John. Perhaps Anne kept up such a schedule because she thought he didn't have long to live. Within weeks after their return from Houston, he developed a kidney infection so severe it caused blood poisoning. An ambulance pulled up to his house. Paramedics ran inside, picked up John from his bed, and drove him to Presbyterian Hospital. Somehow he recovered, and when the paramedics brought him home, Anne kissed him on the forehead and said, "I'm so proud of you, Johnny." A few weeks later, he developed pneumonia, which forced another trip to the hospital. Once again, he made a comeback, and once again, as he returned home, Anne went through her ritual, kissing his forehead and saying, "I'm so proud of you." For the next few months, his friends constantly dropped in to visit. Driving past the house on their way to and from school, they honked their horns. When John's friend Jeff Brown bought a classic 1939 Chevy Coupe, he drove it onto the McClamrock's front yard so John could see it from his window. And because the newspapers in those days printed the home addresses of people they wrote about, strangers showed up with food and gifts. At least 5 well-wishers gave him copies of Joni, the autobiography of a young woman who was paralyzed at the age of 17 but became a skillful artist, using only her mouth to guide her brush. One Saturday night in May 1975, Anne left home for a few hours with Mac so they could accept John's diploma at Hillcrest High School's graduation ceremony. When his name was announced and Anne began to walk across the stage, the cheers were so loud that people put their hands to their ears. Later, when one journalist came to see him, John remained upbeat, saying he might go to college, take business law courses, and someday try to pass the bar exam. Later that summer, before heading off to college, his friends came over to say their goodbyes. In September, the sound of the crowds cheering at the Hillcrest football games on Friday night began drifting across the neighborhood. Although John's window was always shut, his mother didn't want pollen coming into the house because it might congest his already weak lungs. The sound slipped in anyway. John would listen to the band play the school fight song, and he knew exactly the place in the song where the cheerleaders would kick their long, beautiful legs. Right there, he'd softly say, right there. Now come on, Johnny, we can get through this, Anne would say when she saw that look of despair. She would read to him her favorite lines from a Catholic book of devotion she owned. You can find the good in what seems to be the most horrible thing in the world. God tells us that all misfortunes we must that in all misfortunes we must seek the good. Acting hopeless is easy. The real challenge is to hope. She would also show him a small card titled Prayer of Thanksgiving, which she kept on her bedside table. The prayer ended with the lines, Lord Jesus, may I always trust in your generous mercy and love. But a lot of people who knew the McClamrocks could not help but wonder if God had abandoned them. In 1977, John's little brother Henry went to a doctor, found cancerous lymph nodes in his neck, and after removing him said there was no guarantee the cancer was gone. And a few months later, after paying his own visit to the doctor, Matt came home and told Anne that his nagging cough had been diagnosed as acute emphysema. Mac's breathing worsened. Oxygen tanks piled up in their bedroom. In January 1978, he walked down the hall to sit with John. Wheezing, he patted his son on the shoulder and said he was going to need to spend a little time in the hospital. He walked out of the house, and he died 4 days later. Mac's funeral was held on a frigidly cold afternoon. Anne dressed John in a suit that he hadn't worn in 5 years and had him driven in a van to Christ the King Catholic Church. Other than his emergency trips to the hospital, it was the only time he had been out of the house. And as he was pulled from the van and placed onto a stretcher outside the church, he began to exhale. I can see my breath, he said, his eyes widening. I can see my breath. He was pushed to the front of the sanctuary next to the family's front row pew, and he turned his head so that he could watch a priest swing a burner of incense over his father's casket. When John started to sob, Henry wiped the tears from his eyes with a tissue. Anne and Henry and John returned home from the funeral, and Anne walked into John's room. We're going to keep fighting, she said. That's all I ask. We're going to keep fighting. They lived on Social Security disability benefits and a little insurance money. To help make ends meet, Anne, who had never gone back to her bank job, found part-time work with an answering service, taking after-hour phone calls for a Dallas heating and air conditioning company that were forwarded to the McClamrock house. She and John developed a daily routine. In the mornings, either she read to him mostly stories out of Reader's Digest, or he read alone, using a page-turning device that he could operate with a nod of his head. They watched game shows and Guiding Light, the soap opera. They watched all the news broadcasts, and they watched movies on a VCR. Henry, who by then was living in his own apartment and working as a car salesman, would come over to sit with John on Sundays so that Anne could go to church and go to the grocery store. When she returned, she would always fix a huge meal, usually pot roast or chicken. And finally, at the end of each night, she would kiss John on the forehead and go off to her own bed, always reading her prayer of thanksgiving before falling asleep. At least once a year, John came close to dying. He developed a urinary tract infection that nearly caused renal failure. Bladder stones clogged his catheter. His lungs filled with fluid, nearly drowning him. During his stays at the hospital, the doctors would say to Anne, "It's touch and go." But he recovered, and as always, he was brought back into the house. Anne would kiss him on the forehead and say, "Johnny, I'm so proud of you." Although John had found it impossible to get through a college correspondence course because he couldn't write anything down, he did begin watching all the history documentaries on PBS. And he studied encyclopedia entries in hopes that someday he would be able to answer all the questions on Jeopardy. He carefully read the newspaper, his mother folding the pages and putting them in front of him, so that he would have a better chance at guessing who would be Person of the Week on ABC's Friday evening newscast. Sometimes he'd blow into a specially designed tube that allowed him to turn off the radio or television, and when he did that, he'd just stare at the ceiling, letting his mind wander. He kept a mental list of places he wanted to see: Alaska, the Swiss Alps, and the Colosseum, in Rome. He imagined himself taking a trip down the Nile or exploring Yellowstone Park. And he spent hours thinking back on his life before his injury, the street basketball games he played with neighborhood kids, the time he put 20 pieces of bubble gum in his mouth in junior high school, the students who passed by him in the halls, the Saturday nights cruising in his El Camino. He seemed to remember some days at Hillcrest in their entirety, right down to the food he ate in the cafeteria. "It's like everyone else has all these new memories filling up their brains," he told one of his old high school friends. "All I've got are the ones before October 1973. In March 1986, to nearly everyone's surprise, he made it to his 30th birthday. Anne threw one of her old-fashioned dinner parties, inviting relatives and friends. At the end of the meal, she sang Skinnamarink, her favorite song, and then she sang the ballad, "How Many Arms Have Held You." The dining room got strangely quiet. Everyone stared at Anne, this woman in her 60s, who refused to be broken. At the end of the song, they turned to look at the motionless John, who was smiling at his mother, cheerfully telling her that she sang off key. You simply could not believe how they were able to do it, day after day, Anne's niece, Frances Anne later said. I'd say to her, "Don't you ever feel overwhelmed?" And she would say, "Frances Anne, we can either act hopeless or we can make the best out of the life we have been given." And she'd show me that prayer of thanksgiving card, and she'd say, "God will provide. I know He will." Another year passed, and then another. Around the neighborhood, older residents began to sell off their little houses to a new generation of wealthy Dallasites who would almost immediately tear them down to build mansions with impressive great rooms. Ambitious young real estate agents would knock on the front door of the McClamrock home, and when Anne answered, they'd tell her that they could get her a large amount of money if she'd sell. But she would quickly turn them away, their business cards still in their hands. "I'm sorry," Anne would say politely, "but this is our home." It was perfectly understandable that the new residents knew nothing about the McClamrocks. By then, John was no longer being written up in the newspapers. Reporters predictably had found other senseless tragedies to write about. In fact, by the time the 90s rolled around, many of John's classmates, the very ones who had flocked to the intensive care waiting room so many years ago, had also lost touch with him. They'd certainly meant to visit, but one thing or another had gotten in the way, and now, after so many years, they were no longer sure how to restart the friendship they had once had. But in 1995, the organizers of the 20th reunion festivities for Hillcrest Class of 75 put out the word that John and his mother would be more than happy to entertain visitors. During the reunion weekend, 50 or so classmates went by the house, and they were stunned at what they saw. Perhaps because he had not spent a day in the sun since 1973, John hardly seemed to have aged. His skin was perfectly smooth, and his hair was still jet black and long over the ears, exactly the way all the guys used to wear their hair in high school. And except for the shotgun, John had told Henry years earlier to take it down and give it to someone who could use it. Nothing in his room had changed. The photos of John in his football uniform were still on the wall, and his clothes from high school, including his jersey, his bell-bottom jeans, and his loud patterned shirts, were still in the closet. Even the same shag carpet covered the floor. A couple women who had once dated him blinked back tears when they saw him. Another classmate, Sarah Foxworth, a Dallas housewife and mother, gasped when she walked into his room and he called her name. "But I thought you didn't know who I was," she said. "I was too shy to talk to you." "You sat 3 seats behind me in English," he said, "and your locker was over by the cafeteria." He gave her a smile. "I remember," he said. Several of his old teammates, still muscular and narrow-waisted, had no idea what to say to him. They certainly didn't want to make John feel worse about his plight by telling him about all the things they had done since high school. But John asked them about their careers, their wives and children, and where they went on vacation. He also assured them that he was doing just fine, that he even watched football on weekends, and that he did not flinch when he saw a jarring tackle. "I'm the same person I've always been, only I don't move," he said. And when each of his visitors told him goodbye, he said cheerfully, "Come on back anytime you want. Believe me, I'm not going anywhere." Some of his classmates did come back around. A few of them brought along their children to meet John so they could learn about courage. When classmate Sarah Foxworth was diagnosed with leukemia, she showed up at the McClamrocks. After she left, John asked his mother to come into his room with some stationery so that he could dictate a letter to Sarah. He had his mom write the lines, "You can find good in what seems to be the most horrible thing in the world. Take good care of yourself, Sarah. Sincerely, John McClamrock." By then, Anne was in her late 70s and she was still maintaining her daily schedule, changing John's catheter, cleaning his bottom, turning him every couple of hours, refusing any help. A few years earlier, after reading an article in Reader's Digest about exercise and a healthy heart, she had ordered a cheap stationary bicycle from a college, which she put in her bedroom and faithfully pedaled each night. But she knew that time was catching up with her. It wasn't long after the 20th reunion that she began adding a single sentence to the end of her prayer of Thanksgiving. She asked God to let her live one day longer than John. Only one day, she fervently prayed, so that she could always take care of him. "I'm not going to leave him," she told Henry. "He's hung on for me. I will be hanging on for him." John did continue to hang on. He came down with a urinary tract infection. His intestines suddenly twisted. He got a bed sore so severe that plastic surgery was required. His lungs again filled up with fluid. But each time he bounced back. As paramedics carried him inside the house, he would say, "Mom, I'm still kicking." And his mother, following her ritual, would kiss him on the forehead and say, "Johnny, I'm so proud of you." One afternoon, a pretty brunette named Jane Grunwald, who had been a classmate of John's, came for a visit. Jane had married soon after graduating from Hillcrest, and she had spent 20 years trying to be what she described as the perfect PTA mom, raising 2 children in the suburbs. But her marriage had fallen apart, and she was struggling. On that first visit, she and John talked for 2 hours. She began returning once a month, often wearing a lovely black dress, always bringing along a Hershey's Kisses for John. Before she arrived, John would have his mother wash his hair, comb his mustache, dab some cologne on his neck, and then pull his bedsheet up to his chin so that Jane wouldn't have to see his painfully thin body. Sometimes Anne would fix them cocktails, carrying them into John's room on a tray, with a straw always taped to the side of John's glass. Then she'd leave him alone. During one visit, Jane told him that he was the kind of man she longed for, someone who genuinely appreciated her. "And you're always there for me," she said. "Well, that's true," John replied. "You never have to worry about me running around on you." He later told Henry that his monthly visits from Jane were his version of a love affair. "Not that we were going to have sex," he said with a sort of resigned smile. "You know, I never had sex. I'll never make love to a woman." He gave his brother a look. "Is there any way you can tell me what that feels like? To make love?" For Anne's 82nd birthday, on January 12, 2001, Henry brought home a gift along with a takeout chicken enchilada dinner from El Phoenix and a bag of red licorice, her favorite candy. "To Mom, still kicking," John said as she opened her present, a small bottle of perfume that Henry had bought at Dillard's. 5 years later, on her 87th birthday, Henry again came home with takeout enchiladas and a bag of red licorice. And John again said, "To Mom," still kicking. By then, however, it was obvious she was slowing down. Instead of getting dressed as soon as she got out of bed, she spent her mornings in her nightgown and her favorite green terry cloth bathrobe. She was having trouble hearing, and her eyesight was weakening. She began to wobble when she walked, and once she fell while cooking breakfast. A doctor told her that she had a type of vertigo and that she needed to stay off her feet. "Absolutely not," she replied. But in the fall of 2007, she fell again, breaking a bone in her right shoulder. She went to the hospital, but she left a couple of days earlier than the doctors wanted. "I have to keep going," she said when Henry came to take her home, and she suddenly burst into tears. "Henry, I can't leave him." Only then did she allow Henry to take over the task of turning John in his bed. She let him make instant coffee in the morning for the three of them. Because of her eyesight, she also agreed to let Henry drive her to Christ the King and to the grocery store on Sundays. But she still had very precise rules for their excursions. She told Henry that as soon as he dropped her off at church, he had to immediately return to the house to sit with John. He then could pick her up at the end of the service and take her to the grocery store. But he had to drive right back to the house again to sit with John, and he could return to the grocery store only when Anne called him. January 2008. Anne, John, and Henry celebrated her 89th birthday with, yes, another takeout meal from Mel Phoenix and another bag of red licorice. By then, she was having dreams at night. In her dreams, John was walking around the house. She'd never had dreams like that before. "What does it mean?" she asked Henry. "What do you think it means?" Not long after those dreams began, 2 new bed sores appeared on the backs of John's knees. Within days, he developed a fever, and because he could not cough with any strength, he was unable to expel any dust or mucus from his lungs. His weight dropped to 98 pounds. "You have to admit, my body held up for a long time," he said when Henry dropped by to check on him. John said, "Why don't you bring Mom over one day? Have her look pretty. She'd like for me to see her that way." "John," Henry said, "are you giving up?" There was a long silence. A food cart rattled down the hallway, and a nurse's sneakers squeaked on the floors. From other rooms came the beeps of heart monitors and the deep whooshing sounds of ventilators. "We know about her prayer," John finally said. "We know she doesn't want to go first." He looked at Henry and said, "I need to go so she can go." On March 18th, Henry drove Anne to JCPenney to get her hair done before he took her to the rehabilitation facility. Because she was so feeble, Henry put her in a wheelchair. He pushed her into John's room, where she immediately began to check his catheter and inspect the bandages on his bedsore. "Mom, it's okay," John said. Anne smoothed John's hair along the temples. She touched her son's forehead, and she slowly ran her hand down one side of his face, past his cheekbones and the curls of his hair. She said, as if she knew what was about to happen, "Johnny, you know we'll be back together soon." "I know," John said. Then he told his mother something he had never said before. "Mom, I know how hard this has been for you." "Hard?" Anne asked. "Johnny, it's been an honor." Henry took her home, helped her into her bed, and made sure she had her prayer of thanksgiving card. After she fell asleep, he drove back to the rehabilitation facility to check on John one more time. A nurse greeted him at the door and said John had died about 30 minutes earlier. He had closed his eyes and quietly drifted away, not making a single sound. It was standing room only for the funeral. Some of his childhood friends had flown in from around the country. Jane Grunfield, of course, arrived in one of her black dresses, and Sarah Foxworth, less than a year away from death herself from cancer, was also there, gingerly taking a seat at the end of a pew. The mourners looked toward the front rows to get a glimpse of Anne. But just before the service began, a priest walked up to the pulpit to announce that she and Henry would not be there. Earlier that morning, the priest said, Anne had collapsed while getting dressed for the funeral, and Henry had to rush her to the hospital. The organist launched into the opening hymn, and John's casket was rolled down the main aisle. He was dressed in the same suit he had worn for his father's funeral. The priest waved a burner of incense over John's casket and said, May the Lord bless this man who is finally freed of the binds that have held him. May John run over fields of green. Anne returned home a couple of days later. Clearly disoriented, she wandered through the house, always holding onto a wall, not sure what to do. At one point, she picked up the phone and asked Henry for the number of a Dallas department store that had been closed for decades. She asked to talk to her father, who had been dead for 50 years. She then stood in the doorway of John's bedroom, staring blankly at his bed. Johnny, she said, Johnny, are you walking? 8 weeks later, Anne died in her bed, her prayer of thanksgiving card on the bedside table. Henry was beside her, holding her hand. He had her cremated and her ashes put in an urn, which he decided to bury in the ground directly over John's casket at a cemetery near Love Field Airport. At her service, the same priest who had presided over John's funeral said, We now send Anne off today to be with the son she loved, and we send her to the mansions of the saints. The priest was clearly about to say something else about Anne, but then he saw Henry holding his hands to his face. And may God bless Henry, who gave his life to his family, the priest said. God bless Henry. 4 days, Henry just sat in the little house, not sure what to do. He finally got rid of John's hospital bed, and except for his mother's terry cloth robe, he donated all of her clothes to charity. He finally planted a for sale sign in the front yard. Many of the neighborhood's residents were no doubt relieved. The old house was finally going to be demolished so that a new mansion could be built. But despite getting offers, Henry couldn't sell. I know I need to move on and get my life started again, he recently told a visitor while the two of them sat in John's room. But I keep hearing Mom's and John's voices. In the mornings, I keep making 3 cups of instant coffee. When I go to the grocery store, I drive back home as fast as I can, thinking someone might need me. The visitor noticed that Henry had started remodeling, pulling out the old shag carpet and repainting the walls. Henry shrugged. I don't know if I can ever leave, he said. This has been a good home. It's been a very good home. Thanks for listening. Thank you very much.